Hello, I'm Jane Griffiths, and I'm so happy to be here with Laura Sharrow, who writes as LS Sharrow. I love her Gina Slotkin. They're short novels, I suppose you would say. And we're going to talk about her latest one. So hi.
Hi, thank you for interviewing me.
It's a pleasure.
I thought that perhaps I'd start off with the book is only available at this point on ebook on Amazon. But I have a printout of the cover for anyone who's interested.
That's good. It's very atmospheric. And that's what I like about your books, the sense of atmosphere in whatever place they're in. And this one is in a quite different place from what I expected when I started it.
Yeah, it's not in Chicago.
No.
It takes place in Paris.
Exactly. And that was intriguing as soon as I started, because I used to live in France, never in Paris. But so is this about Americans in Paris? No. I mean, yes, there are Americans and they are in Paris, but this is not an American in Paris story. It happens to be set there. And it's not only about Paris. And I like this very much, that it was in a place where the people, the main characters who are there, are not at home. They are in Paris and it's where they live, and some of the characters have lived there for many decades or their whole lives, but they are not at home. And it really struck me that this is a book about, in some ways, not being at home.
Yep.
And what is around that, particularly, I'm a European, particularly around European history. And if I may, when I was thinking about speaking today, I remembered something my grandmother used to say. She was a Londoner. She lived around, she had Jewish friends, Jewish neighbors, and she was on very friendly terms with them. And I remember her saying to me when I was very young, you know, Jewish people, they're not ever really at home. They should go home. And this was her perspective as a non-Jewish person. And I remember asking her what she meant by that. And I said, well, shouldn't they be here? And she said, oh no, Jewish people can be anywhere, but it's such a pity that they don't really have a home like we do. And I just throw that out for what it's worth. My London grandmother, who was born in 1898. And I remember the stories she told and the things she said very, very well.
I appreciate your view on it. When I began the writing process, which began with a lot of research ahead of time, I didn't look at it as almost every character being an outsider. And maybe that's because I'm an outsider myself, and it is what I am. So I wrote, even though I'm not French and I only spent a couple of weeks in Paris. I didn't, for me, most of the characters were just people. I was intrigued by certain kinds of people, and I wanted to tell a particular kind of story about the uprise of Jew hatred. And I wanted to tell it in the genre that I like and that I write in, which is murder mysteries, hard-boiled kind of murder mysteries. So I understand I'm an outsider. I am, and I feel like one all the time, but you get used to that if you live that way all your life. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. And I did wonder when I was reading the book how conscious that was, that everyone there was an outsider. I mean, including, we'll come to this, but including the man from Norway, which I have family in Norway. I have a Norwegian cousin, and I know something about the history there, and it's not pretty. It really is not pretty at all. But there is also a Norwegian in France. I mean, there are Norwegians in France. There are people from all over. And I liked very much the portrayal of the suburbs. Suburbs is the wrong word. It's the only way to translate the French word banlieue, because it means the outer part of the city, some distance from the center, but these are not suburbs as we understand them as English speakers at all. But we'll come to that.
Well, when I arrived at Charles de Gaulle Airport, a cab driver veered off the main highway and took me through those areas. And I said something to him, which I put in the book, which might have made me a lucky woman that day. I said, "The people here are poor." And he said, "Yes, they are." And he looked at me through the rearview mirror. And then within a couple of minutes, we were back on the highway.
Yes. And there are different definitions of poor as well. That's another matter. And I was struck by those suburbs, which I have been to in other French cities, that the precariousness of life,
Yes.
which for poor people all over the world exists. I mean, what's going to happen next? Where are you going to get your next rent payment or whatever?
Your next meal
is your next meal, depending where in the world you are. Exactly. And that's not there in those areas in European cities. You are going to eat. You will have a roof over your head, but that's it. That's what you've been given. Be content, and people are not content.
apparently not, for good
And
reason.
a lot comes from that. A lot comes from that not content feeling. And you put that together with the history of Europe, and this book is set in a few years ago, 2016, when there still were Holocaust survivors living, or there still are some, not very many, and those who are still with us were children at the time.
Yeah.
But still, the last of those people are still with us, and what happened in Paris, and more widely in France, actually, there was a terrible incident in Nice, shows that the hatreds from those times just never went away.
They never go away. They are subsumed for periods of time, only to rear their ugly heads. But they never really go away. And those of us who live with it become more or less used to it. And the more used to it we are, perhaps it either makes us mentally healthier or mentally not well. Who knows?
Well, who knows? But the point is, you have to live with it. You can't say, oh, can we live in another world now where it's not like that? No, this is the world we have. And that's, we have to deal with what there is now. The Stoic philosophers in ancient Greece had it right. They said, do what you can with what you have.
When I was a teenager, because I had experienced a lot of anti-Semitism as a child, pretty violent anti-Semitism, for 2 or 3 years, I hid my Jewishness because my father wasn't Jewish. But eventually, I just couldn't do it any longer. It made me ashamed. It's just, and I understand why people do it. I know people who do it.
I have a very dear friend who is from New York, and she's Jewish. I think her great-grandparents came from Poland, Lithuania, somewhere. She's blonde, she's blue-eyed. She was never taken for Jewish. And she was raised secular. Well, mostly. I mean, that's probably another story, and that's her story to tell. But what she has said to me is that I could pass. And that's something that was so chilling to me to hear, like, why would you have to pass?
And I can pass.
Why are you not allowed to be apparently Jewish? I mean, I couldn't.
And I can pass. And I have a very clear memory of my brother, who was blonde. When his hair began to turn a light brown, my mother put him in a tub and washed his hair with lemon juice, and it came down into his eyes, and he cried. She was trying to keep him blonde. It's just a survival mechanism, I think.
Yes, to me as a non-Jewish person, it's chilling to have to pass, or to feel that being able to pass is something that will be helpful to you. And I have to confess I don't understand it because I haven't lived it, but I see it.
I will tell you that meeting people who are not Jewish, who understand that and are chilled by it, is moving for me, is gratifying. It's a relief to meet people like you, Jane. There are not that many, so.
Well, looking at how things are, certainly in Europe, which is what I know, although I've lived in various countries around the world, including France, it is quite terrifying what is happening right now.
Yes.
In our cities. Your book was written before October the 7th. I'm sorry to mention this, but I feel I have to, because I woke up that morning in horror and disbelief, knowing what would have to happen after this. And also and then subsequently, as this is months ago now, being shocked by the level of
Hatred.
Well, hatred, yes, but also shock that apparently broad-minded, willing to accept various points of view people of my acquaintance would say, well, I didn't know Israel would do this. And I was like, well, what do you mean? I mean, what were they supposed to do? It's like as if France attacked us in, well, I don't live in England now, but England, say. I mean, what would we do? We would have to do something extreme. And
you defend yourselves. You would defend yourselves.
You defend yourself, and every animal, every human, every social grouping will defend itself the best it can when it's under attack. And the notion that, oh no, you shouldn't, because you are you, was terrifying to me, because that's the only time you hear it. You shouldn't defend yourself because you are who you are. You are those people that you are. And that's what they mean. People dress it up in other ways, but that's what they mean.
I recently bumped into someone, and I tend to make a point of extricating myself from anyone who comes up with that kind of slogan, or after October 7th, mentioning that they also care about the Palestinians. And I recently, in a social situation with someone I trusted, said this to me. And it's interesting because he's a gay man. And I said, do you know what they would do to you?
Exactly.
In Gaza?
I mean, I've seen those,
he
like,
did know.
queers for Palestine. I mean, excuse me.
Yes.
You try going that, you see what would happen. You'd be thrown off a building, you'd be worse.
Yeah. And he did know. And he still, and I realized there was in my humble opinion, there was a kind of virtue signaling going on. I'm this gay man and I'm virtuous. And let me show you how virtuous I am.
Oh, I think most of it is about that. It's about, well, we are good people. We are nice, liberal people. We might be gay, we might be whatever. Trans people. So we must be good, liberal people. Therefore, we're okay. What we say is okay. Well, actually, no, it isn't, not necessarily. And that's difficult. But for me personally, and this isn't about me, but I've lost 2 good friends since October the 7th, because the view they took was that it was fine and there should be no retaliation and Israel deserved it. And I'm just like, okay, you can think that, you can say that, but goodbye. Because
because I came from the left. My background is left wing. And I was in the civil rights movement and then in the anti-Vietnam War movement. I've basically left behind everyone, because they all took, before October 7th, they were taking, in my opinion, racist, anti-Jewish racist views that I couldn't tolerate. And I think there was 1 or 2 last people that I'd held on to that I let go of after October 7th. I kept hoping that I could change their minds. And the minds that were changed were people that were largely working class that I knew about.
yes, and that is how it is. I live in Glasgow, Scotland, and what I see around me and the people I talk to, I do go and stand with Glasgow Friends of Israel, who are there and who are protected by the police when they stand every Saturday afternoon in the city centre, to shouts of get the Jews out and the flags. And also you get often very young people shouting at the police who stand nearby, saying, when are you going to clear the Jews out of here? Now, the Jewish population of Glasgow is tiny. I mean, it's there, but it's really, really small. And why would anyone feel threatened in any way? And it's not about that.
Basically, we're pretty tiny everywhere, almost.
Well, yes. And certainly in the UK, my country, it's a small population, which I don't know if people still talk about being assimilated, but it sort of has been. And there are only a couple of areas really where you would even know that Jewish people lived around there.
Mhm.
So what I want to say to people, just what is your problem? Like, what are you so afraid of? What are you worried about?
Yeah. I would like to say one thing before I forget, and that is a long time ago, after you had read my first book, you messaged me and said something along the lines of, you might be one of those people who could talk openly on Facebook or wherever about how not all Jews are rich. And you encouraged me to do that. And eventually I did. So I want to thank you for that, if I haven't before.
No, but it's in this book, in Savage as well, that of course not all Jews are rich. And there is, she says it there, she says, not all Jews are rich, most Jews are not rich. And
She
that's
says
true.
that to the haughty head waiter.
Yes, she does. And I mean, it's so obvious. Of course that's the case. I mean, and even if it wasn't, even if every Jewish person you ever met was a rich person, well, so what, really? The question, if someone's rich, there are fair questions to ask. How did they get rich? Was it okay how they did that? But that's not really the question. The question is, oh, it's those people.
I think we're not allowed to be flawed and to be, for some of us to be good people and some of us to be not good people. We're just not allowed that privilege or that luxury. And some of us are very bad people. And some of us are really decent human beings.
This is true, as it's true of people everywhere.
Of course.
And the same rules don't seem to apply. And that's what has fired me to take the positions I have. I mean, I'm not a public figure, but it doesn't matter. I'll express my opinion and go and stand in my little tiny way with Glasgow Friends of Israel on a Saturday afternoon.
That's all we can do, is our little tiny bit, I think.
Well, yes, exactly. And that's true on every issue and on everything. You can't change the world. You can't say, oh, I'll make things different. You can't. But you can do your own small thing, what you are capable of. And it's possible. You don't have to go home and wish it would all go away, because it won't go away. None of it will go away.
No, it won't go away. It could subside. It might not subside this time.
It might not. I mean, it has in decades past. I mean, my growing up, my parents, English born and so on, they were Zionists. They weren't Jewish, but it was just, I remember my mother saying to me, I remember asking her when in 1967, when that happened, and I said to her, oh, I was 13. I said, are we on Israel's side? Do we go and fight for Israel? And she said, well, I don't think we'll have to, but if necessary, we should, because Israel is right, because of what happened. And she was a girl in London in the Second World War. And she said at the age of 12, 13, 14, when the Blitz was happening in London and she was there, she said she knew why the war was being fought. I mean, she said that she knew, her father used to talk to her, and he was a very thoughtful man, my grandfather. And he said, oh, they told us it was all about Poland. And it wasn't really about Poland. It was, they wanted to get rid of the Jews from Europe, and we had to stand against that. and that was what my grandfather said, and he told it to my mother when she was 12 and 13, and she remembered that and talked that way to me when I was 12 and 13. So it's, people are lied to by governments. I mean, that
Yes,
happens
indeed.
all the time.
This may surprise you, but I started off my young adult life as an anti-Zionist. My mother was involved in an organization as a good Jewish woman called the Palestine Human Rights Campaign. And slowly over time, I just saw too many discrepancies, too many lies, too many semi-lies. And eventually my eyes were completely opened. And I think it may be one of the reasons why I felt so moved and driven to write these particular novels. I could have written my character anywhere. I could have made her not Jewish, but more and more that became important to me on a visceral level, I suppose you would say. I wonder if I might read
Please
two or three pages. This is from chapter 6. And I'm going to start in the middle of the chapter. The name of the chapter is Death at Sundown. And it takes place on the first night of Passover with my main character, Gina Slotkin, who is a private detective, and her husband, Paul Loya, who is also a private detective and is a Sephardic Jew. And the first page and a half or so describe them setting the Seder table and bringing out the food and preparing for the ritual. And I'll start here. Stepping into our bedroom, Paul returned with 2 Haggadot. Grateful his family had managed to hold on to their heritage, never becoming full-fledged Catholics except as a charade, I opened my Haggadah. Inside, the 19th century woodcuts presented Hebrew text in Aramaic and the Judeo-Spanish language, Ladino Hebrew. I trace a finger over a woodcut. It didn't show Jews enslaved in Egypt. Rather, it showed a bunch of bearded men and only one woman sitting at a table with goblets of wine and a Seder plate, not unlike the one in front of us this Friday. Wedged in the pages was a folded letter from Paul's grandfather in which he had transcribed the lyrics to a children's song about frogs. I swallowed hard. Paul brought out a silver goblet. Elijah's cup, he said. He placed the candlesticks on the table and switched off the overhead lights. Indigo had settled outside and the night was a canopy. I draped a white lace shawl over my hair, the one my mother Rosina used to borrow from my bubby. I lit the candles. Wavering light illuminated the small watercolor painting on the wall, and the outline of Paul's handsome face took on the color of the flames. 3 times I passed the tips of my fingers over the 2 flames. 3 times I brought my hands to my forehead. Together we chanted, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam. A thin, blood-curdling scream came from upstairs inside the apartment building. Candles flickering, I dropped my hands and gazed at Paul. That was a woman's scream. Adele, I said. I blew out the flames. The 2 of us raced through the office, onto the sidewalk and into the building's main entrance. Paul took the stairs 3 at a time. I came behind him 2 at a time. Hey, he shouted. From above came sounds of the scuffle. A young man with a red checkered keffiyeh bumped past me on the stairs. I rushed around the landing to find Paul tackling a second man in a brown leather jacket. Paul had him on the carpet, one knee on his thigh. Paul held his hands together behind his back. Paul turned his face to me. Adele's door is open. Go. From behind me, Keffiyeh man came at Paul. He kicked Paul in the side of his ribs. He fell sideways off the man in the leather jacket. Keffiyeh man helped the partner to his feet. They shot past me down the stairs and out the front door. The front door whined open and then thudded closed. Paul, I knelt at his side. Talk to me. He groaned. Adele. I left him on the carpet and ran through her office, her open door, into the foyer. Adele? At my feet lay a bloody switchblade knife. I went into the living room. On the leather sofa, Adele Levy lay with a rip in the middle of her floral dress. Her dark eyes stared lifeless. Oh no. I stiffened when I heard the front door click closed. I turned to find Paul moving toward me. Silently, we did a slow, careful search of the apartment for more attackers. Except for the three of us, there were no other souls present. At the end table, next to the leather sofa, Paul took a clean white handkerchief from his pocket and picked up the landline phone. He dialed. Police? There's been a murder at 39 Avenue Bertil, at apartment 4, 7th arrondissement. A stabbing. That's right. I'm Paul Loya. My wife and I are with the body. We will wait here. He put the phone back in its cradle. How fast will they get here? I asked. Gina, we're going to need our guns.
Thank you. And I was very struck by that last line, we're going to need our guns, because on one level, as a non-American, I see guns as something that Americans use, that is part of the culture in the US in the way that it's not in Europe. But of course, that's not the whole significance of that line, is it? We're going to need our guns. We have got to have serious weapons.
I didn't make that connection when I wrote it, but I understand you're making the connection, and I do now, especially since October 7th.
I mean, I made some notes, and that's that I wrote that line, we're going to need our guns. There's gun crime in France. Of course there is everywhere, but it's not, even now, it's not a big thing. It exists, it happens. But that's not what that line says. But the atmosphere, your books are very atmospheric.
Thank you.
They take me to places I usually haven't been. And you said you only spent a short time in France.
10 days.
And I don't know Paris any better than you, I'm quite sure, because I lived elsewhere in France and most of France is not Paris. But I loved the front door whined open. That's exactly the sound. All French apartment buildings are the same, and all their front doors make the same sound when they open, and they all click shut everywhere. And I just loved that. And I loved the little American in Paris
Mispronunciation.
At a certain point, Paul comes back to the apartment with coffee, like you take away coffee. Americans do that. French people don't do that. And that was like, tell me you're an American in Paris. You've got, I mean, you can go to a coffee shop and ask for it à emporter, to take away, and they will give it to you. But French people just don't do that. But Americans do. I don't know why they do, but they do. And so there were those things, and that at a certain point, there are croissants in the fridge. like, why would croissants ever be in the fridge? Because you buy them in the morning from the bakery and then you eat them and that's it. And like,
I gave myself away. If nothing else did, I gave myself away as an American.
but that was the point. That's just like a tiny remark about something else, and there are croissants in the fridge. These are Americans. These are not French people. But it was just such a delight.
Thank you.
And
we're not always looked at as delightful. We Americans.
Well, I'm aware of that, and neither are we, especially in France. Our relationship is much more troubled with the people of France than the American relationship is. I mean, I take your point. American tourists are seen as they are around the world, and it's a little unfair mostly.
When I was in France, when I was in Paris, and I told you this before, I got along very well with French people, and I spoke in very fractured French. And I introduced myself by saying, "Désolé, je suis américaine, désolé pour Trump." And people threw back their hands and laughed. For anyone who doesn't understand French, I just said to any French person I was starting a conversation with, "I'm sorry, I'm an American, and I'm sorry for Trump." And people just immediately melted. And we had these great conversations that were awkward and fractured, but fun. So.
Yes, and that's all it takes, is to just try and say something in French. You don't have to be able to speak French at all well. You just try. And the Brits are guilty of not doing that,
Yes.
much as Americans have the reputation of not doing that. Our relationship is fraught in a different way because we fought wars with each other, and one of us conquered the other one, and it was all a bit bad really over centuries. But my point really was that I loved the subtle, tiny references to being an American in Paris, because
I didn't know they were references. I didn't
well,
know
it's
they
just
were
like,
so tiny.
tell me you're an American in Paris without telling me there are croissants in the fridge.
I didn't know that was a no-no.
Well, it's not a no-no. It's just that, I mean, you're allowed to do it, but just no French person ever would. And I suppose French people might sometimes get coffee to go, as you would say, but I've never seen it. I mean, you can, but you just don't see it. But there you are, and I was like, an apartment in the 7th arrondissement for 500 euros a month. Like, you're never going to leave. You just, you know,
And those are actually the landlord and his daughter may be the only two native French people that are not outsiders. Yes. Yeah, they may be the only two in the novel. I'd have to think about it, but I think they are.
I hadn't thought about that when I was reading it, but I think that's right, because they are, aren't they? But no one else is. I mean, there's the taxi driver who was born in presumably Greater Paris, and his heritage is elsewhere, and that's what he looks to. The same with the young woman who, in a different way, is looking elsewhere from where she was born, certainly. And what was striking, and I don't know what your intention was here, but the little painted lorry, I would call it, a truck, that the child played with, that his father had presumably played with, because it was an antique. And I remember seeing those in France, that they're really popular, those painted metal trucks. And that was a sort of indicator of well, this is a family that has been here for 2, 3 more generations, a number of generations. Because here is a small child playing with a toy that his father had.
Mhm.
And it seemed to me there was no reason to mention it other than to show continuity.
Well, there was that lorry, that truck in the Airbnb where I stayed with my family.
Well, there you are. I said they were popular and I'd seen them around, although they're old things, but they don't get broken because they're metal and they last, so families keep them. But it was just an indicator of generations that live in the same place. And that's important in a story that features outsiders.
And I made the decision to have the landlord have his parents having been in the French underground. I just felt it was really important to have one character who fit that description. And it just came to me in the middle of the writing that I wanted that to be part of his backstory, his history.
And yes, I can see that. I mean, it's true to say, though, that in present day France, people will say, oh, my grandfather was in the Resistance. Everyone's grandfather was in it, except most of them weren't, because otherwise how could what they call the Veldiv, when the French Jews were rounded up in the cycle velodrome and sent off, how could that happen? People the people of Greater Paris were told, bring out your Jewish neighbors, tell us where they are. And they, in distressingly large numbers, did that. They didn't, this is nothing to do with your book, but in Italy, they didn't do it. They had the same directive. And they just didn't do it. They were just like, Mr. Cohen, who lives next door to me, no, I'm not going to tell them he's there.
Do you have an opinion about why there was a difference?
No, Primo Levi has written about it, but, well, he did write about it, but factually to say, I mean, he was Jewish himself, and he said, well, no, because he lived in a small town and there was a small but significant Jewish population and they were never denounced. People just were like, why would we even do that? In France, they did it. In the Netherlands, they were very mixed. In Norway, they did it. In Norway, the Jewish population of Norway was minute. I mean, the population of Norway is very small. And they did it. They sent out such Jewish people as were there. They sent them to their deaths and were quite happy to do it.
Long time ago, I knew a Danish Jew whose grandfather was one of those who was rescued and sent to Sweden, along with almost all the Danish Jews, which I thought, when I heard that, I didn't know that story. I heard that story for the first time in my 40s, and it brought tears to my eyes. I had no idea.
And I actually didn't know that until I read your book. And then I looked it up, and it's true. Not all the Danish Jews, but most of them were sheltered by Sweden in one way or another. There's a very interesting novel I've just read, which is actually about the Netherlands rather than Denmark or Sweden, but is about this whole notion of sheltering and what happened. And it's set in the Netherlands, and it's about someone who inserts themselves into the life of another person. And it turns out that there is a whole back history going back to World War II and how that person had to leave that house and tried to come back. So those stories are still with us. The stories of the Danish Jews who were sheltered by Sweden, the former colonial power, of course. A Dutch Jewish person who was denounced by their neighbors and tried to come back later and was denounced again. I don't say the whole of the Netherlands is like that, but that is there. So the history of Europe is checkered, and the outcomes of that are still there. And it does seem striking to me as someone who grew up in England. We weren't invaded, we weren't occupied. Other European countries were. And how do you respond when you're occupied? And your book isn't about that at all, but it made me think about it, because it made me think about what happened in Europe. And I've said this before, I particularly loved that there was a character from Norway. Because why would he be Norwegian? This is just random. There was a resistance in Norway. There was also collaboration in Norway, and that happened all over, certainly Northern Europe. Quisling was Norwegian, and that word has come into the language. So it's a murder mystery. It's a detective story. It's a comedy in places. And it has something to say about the history of Europe. As a European, that's what I enjoyed about it. I read a previous one that was set in Chicago and was just American. And that heritage is not mine. And I was fascinated by the atmosphere and how you could have an Italian uncle and a Mexican grandfather and be from a Jewish family and be in Chicago. And this is not my world. Europe is my world in some ways. And here is an American Jewish detective in Europe doing things with guns, obviously with guns. But the scary mansion with the creepy billionaire, or I suppose he's a billionaire if he can, live in a place like that, is kind of like a movie. I mean, there you can see it. The film version they would make a lot. Whoever directs it, they'll make such a lot of the mansion with the soft-footed servant and the whale steaks being delivered.
I borrowed heavily from Raymond Chandler.
No, really?
Without the racism and without the anti-Semitism and without the sexism.
No, he was terrible, but great writing.
So I borrowed from him unashamedly.
But so has everyone. And there is almost always the scary mansion with the billionaire. I mean, every good detective story has got that. And is it, now this is my ignorance, or lack of memory, but is it The Big Sleep, where you have the billionaire in the hothouse at the beginning?
Probably.
It's very
hot. Yeah. I think so.
And there's just always those mansions. So it was very satisfying to read.
Thank you.
Oh, there's the mansion. There has to be a mansion.
It's a cliche. It's a bit of a cliche.
But it's a good one. And it really works, because what it shows you is, here's this very rich, powerful person, apparently powerful, why have they got that mansion? How did they? It makes you think, well, if he's just a you know, a person campaigning for this and that. You don't get rich doing that. So how did he get rich? He's being funded somehow.
Also, Dashiell Hammett.
Yeah, and that's what the mansion is for, to show that this person is rich and they got rich somehow. I mean, it goes right back in American literature, doesn't it? I mean, what about The Great Gatsby, which is a very different thing, but nobody ever quite knows how he's living in that place and how he is so fabulously rich. I mean, you can make a good guess, but you're never told.
Very hinted. It's hinted at you without being told, which is much more interesting. The last thing you want to do is tell the reader, because that's boring.
It is boring. If you've been told, then you're like, okay, I don't need to read on.
I don't need to read this. I'll move on to something else. You want to show it because that actually activates the curiosity of the reader. They want to read the next page, what happens next and what happens after that. And I mean, every once in a while you do have to tell, but you don't have to do it very often.
Not that much and not that often. And Gina has had a hysterectomy, and I loved it. There's a scene where she has a shower and she just touches the scar, because that would be a normal thing to do if you have any kind of post-surgery scar. And it doesn't say, oh, isn't it terrible? I've had a hysterectomy. I can't have children now. Because you don't need to say that. She's had a hysterectomy. She's not going to have children. It appears that she would have liked to have a child, but you were not told that, but you know it. And that's what I like about your short novels, that they don't take that many pages.
No.
And they show you a lot. They don't tell you very much, but they show you a lot.
Thank you. That's very kind of you to say. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for writing them and letting me read them.
Thank you for the interview.
My pleasure.
It's been a pleasure. Have a good evening.